He was then ecumenical in the best sense, but he was also realistic and perhaps knew more about the inroads that liberal Protestant theology had made in the churches of the Reformation than those who formulated the decree on ecumenism at Vatican II. In his first book, The Arians of the 4th Century, published in 1833, Newman not only echoed Clement of Alexandria in speaking of the dispensation of paganism, but also raised, and I quote, a possibility which Vatican II, in its declaration on the relation of the Church to non-Christian religions, never considered, namely, that the mediation of the Church might not be essential for the salvation of every man and woman, even going so far as to say years later that it does not follow, because there is no church but one, which has the evangelical gifts and privileges to bestow, that therefore no one can be saved without the intervention of that one church. However, radical as Newman was, he never embraced the kind of pluralist theology by which many Catholics were tempted after the Council. In his reverent assent, he insisted that all the providences of God center in Christ. As he had declared in an Anglican sermon, Christ's death upon the cross is the sole meritorious cause, the sole cause of spiritual blessing for our guilty race. The dogmatic constitution on divine revelation emphasizes that God reveals his own self in Christ rather than truths about himself. Christ, the Constitution declares, is himself both the mediator and the sum total of revelation. This understanding of revelation as primarily personal rather than propositional is also that of Newman. And I quote, "What Catholics, what church doctors, as well as apostles have never lived on, is not any number of theological canons or decrees, but Christ himself, as he is represented in concrete existence in the Gospels." But whereas there was a tendency after the Second Vatican Council to downplay dogmatic propositions, as was illustrated most disastrously in education and catechetics, Newman himself was in no doubt that the self-revealing of God necessarily involves propositional revelation. Why should God speak unless he meant to say something? Why should he say it unless he meant us to hear? If there has been a revelation, then there must be some essential doctrine proposed by it to our faith. Religion cannot be dogmatic, it ever has been. After all, the Christian revelation is no mere philosophy thrown upon the world at large, no mere quality of mind and thought, no mere beautiful and deep sentiment or subjective opinion, but a substantive message from above. The Declaration on Religious Liberty, or religious freedom, is surprising for us today to recall, and especially of course in this country and in Britain, was at the time the most controversial of the Council's documents, Dignitatis Humanae, raising, as it did very clearly, the whole thorny question of doctrinal development. The late Archbishop Lefebvre voted against it on the ground that it represented a complete departure from the constant teaching of the Church. 5 years ago, I hope I showed in a paper delivered at a conference in Rome to commemorate the 40th anniversary of that declaration, that in fact it passed all 7 of the tests or notes that Newman offered in his essay on the development of Christian doctrine, to distinguish changes that are developments from changes that are corruptions. The old teaching had to be changed because the Church was no longer operating within a Christian Europe in which religion provided the moral and cultural framework, and where an attack upon the established Catholic religion was seen as a civil offence. Papal condemnations of religious freedom in the 19th century can also be seen against the anti-clerical claim that freedom of conscience meant that religion was a purely private matter in a secular society that had no connection with religion. There had to be a development of the teaching in a vastly different society, so that the essential teaching that Catholicism is the true religion should remain the same, intact but unadulterated by factors relevant to a very different political and social context. Newman himself was well aware that change was already necessary in his own time. He wrote, "I'm not at all sure that it would not be better for the Catholic religion everywhere if it had no very different status from that which it has in England. I think Italy will be more religious when the Church has to fight for its supremacy than when that supremacy depends on the provisions of courts and police and territorial claims. Very radical, not to say revolutionary words in his own time. There is little doubt, I think, that the conciliar document which Newman would have been least comfortable is the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. He would have been suspicious of the 60s optimism it reflects, and he would have been alarmed by that notorious phrase, the autonomy of earthly affairs, in paragraph 36, even though the article in which it occurs concludes by hastily denying that material being does not depend on God. The chances of that phrase being taken out of context, and particularly if detached from the earlier text so beloved of Pope John Paul II, namely, it is only in the mystery of the Word made flesh that the mystery of man truly becomes clear, Article 22. The chances of that phrase, as I say, being taken out of context would have struck Newman, and he would not have been surprised by the emergence of the notion after the Council that justice and peace practically constitute the gospel of Christ. For Newman, it was intolerable to identify the vision of Christ's kingdom with mere human civilization, which he wrote is a second-rate perfection of nature, being what it is and remaining what it is without any supernatural principle, particularly when the means employed to achieve this civilization are based on unchristian principles. That said, however, Newman certainly anticipated the document in wanting the Church to engage with the modern world and to abandon the siege mentality of Pio Nono. He held the highly unfashionable and unpopular view that the temporal power of the papacy was inimical to the Church's interests, and as we have already seen, he thought that the establishment of Catholicism as a state religion had become counterproductive in continental Europe, and it was inconsistent for Catholics to enjoy religious freedom in England while Protestants were denied the same freedom in Italy. I have left to the last the conciliar document, which is surely the most important of all, and which has a special relevance to the second part of my lecture this afternoon, namely Lumen Gentium, or the dogmatic constitution of the Church. Since the Second Vatican Council was a council that was almost totally concerned with the Church, the document in which the Council examines the very nature of the Church itself must surely be the most important. Now, it is, of course, only too well known that Newman was a lonely pioneer of the laity in the highly clerical Church of the 19th century. The author of what is held to be the classic text of the theology of the laity, his article on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine. And there is no doubt that he would have welcomed the chapter on the laity in the Constitution of the Church. The other chapter that attracted most attention at the time, often after the Council, was the chapter on the bishops. And Newman would certainly have seen this chapter as a necessary addition to, and in that sense, modification of the definition of papal infallibility at Vatican I, which had intended to produce a larger teaching about the Church, an intention that was frustrated by the indefinite suspension of the Council due to political events in Italy. To adapt his words about Pope St. Leo and the Council of Chalcedon, this chapter on the Apostolic College, Article 22, without of course touching the definition of the previous Council, trimmed the balance of doctrine by completing it, namely, papal infallibility being completed by a statement about the Apostolic College. However, there are two other chapters which have been comparatively ignored in comparison to the chapters on the laity and bishops, but which constitute the Council's fundamental understanding of the nature of the Church, and which were anticipated by Newman. I refer, of course, to the first two chapters, the mystery of the Church and the people of God, which define in thoroughly patristic and scriptural terms the Council's definition of what Newman would have called the idea of the Church.